And maybe what we can do to get things going as far as introduction, since we're doing this in a virtual world, is if we could maybe introduce ourselves. Let's maybe start off with the voting members. I'll start off with myself, Kevin Hansen with the Matt board. Maybe go around, just introduce yourself and who you're representing.
Jim Austin, City of Dilworth.
Hey, Jim.
I sit next to Jim.
West Fargo City Commission.
You got Brad.
Sarah.
Good morning. This is Teresa.
Hey, Teresa.
Hi, Teresa with M State.
Jackie Maas with Concordia College.
Good morning.
John Strand, City of Fargo.
Brett Stevens, NDSU.
Morning, Brett. We got Sarah from City of Moorhead.
Steve Lindos from City of Moorhead.
Got Deb.
Yeah, Deb White. I'm a guest today, City of Moorhead.
Okay, did I miss any of the voting members? Okay, everybody. Okay, how about City of Fargo staff?
This is Julie with City of Fargo Transit.
Matt with City of Fargo Transit.
Jordan Smith with Matt Bus.
Full Swingham, City of Fargo Transit.
Okay, any Moorhead staff?
Lori Van Beek, Moorhead Transit Manager.
Anybody else on the call?
Karen Hayes with Assistant Transit Planner and Marketing Specialist for Moorhead.
And good morning, this is Lisa Bodie from the City of Moorhead.
Morning, Lisa.
And Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure you know I'm not a voting member. When you called my name, I'm just here because Lori invited the other members of the council to attend for the presentation. Sure. So I just didn't want to make sure you were counting that in the quorum. I miss serving on this commission, but it's, yeah.
Thanks, Deb. All right. Did anybody else on the call that we didn't get introduced?
My name is Mike.
I might just join. Sorry.
Okay, this is Joe Capper with SRF Consulting.
Hey, Joe.
Michael Maddox, Metro Park.
Let's get going with our meeting. The first item is the January 20th meeting minutes. We need to approve those, so hopefully you've had a chance to review those minutes, and if so, we would take recommendations to approve the minutes at this time.
Jim Austin makes a motion.
I'll second. This is Sarah.
All right, we have a first by Jim and a second by Sarah. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? The motion is carried. All right, the next item is item 2B, which is the MATS Transit RFP update. Julie and Lori.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. But what we wanted to cover with the board today is that our contracts with First Transit, the City of Moorhead has a contract, City of Fargo has a contract, and that's for driver services and fixed route dispatch at this point. Now, the City of Fargo, as you may remember, will be taking over the fixed route dispatchers this coming January of 2021. So this RFP is a little bit different in that we won't be bidding any dispatch services. So it's for driver and management services. And the RFP request for proposal hit the streets on August 17th, and proposals will all be due on September 23rd. Back at our meeting, which I can't believe was January, we didn't have one since then, but we did get volunteers. Thank you, everyone, for representation on the evaluation team. And in our memo, in your packet, there's a list of those folks there. So we've got Chair Hansen, Commissioner Strand, Councilperson Watson Curry, Britt Stevens with NDSU, Michael Redlinger, who is the City of Fargo Assistant Administrator, Lisa Bodie, who is the Director of, I'm sorry, Lisa, I'm not sure your full title, but with Moorhead. Lori, who's the Transit Manager. I'm the Transit Director for Fargo. Matt is our Assistant Transit Director, and Michael Maddox, who we all know from MetroCog. So some of the considerations that we really wanted to focus on for the incoming bidders to emphasize in their proposals and in the service after they are, someone is selected to provide the service, we want an emphasis on safety, as always. We did put into the RFP, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, minimum wages and benefits that we are going to be holding the contractor to. Now, keeping in mind, of course, they could pay more, but these are minimums. Existing conditions where the contractor's current organizational structure exists, so they have an idea of what they're coming into, plus projected needs and responsibilities for those positions. Any incentive or bonus programs that the proposer is going to bring forward, technology advances, should there be anything that would benefit our operation at this location. We did provide, of course, the projected revenue and service hours, which are Appendix 13 in our packet, and any performance expectations, which we have identified more closely in the actual RFP. So, for example, on-time performance being one of the big ones, customer satisfaction, service, we want to emphasize those, and we do have ways of tracking that information. We also are emphasizing the MAT paratransit operations. Those are for our folks with disabilities that ride the paratransit service. Facility operations, the contractor will participate in at both the Ground Transportation Center and the Metro Transit Garage. And the related duties they will have there. And then any federal, state, and local requirements, for example, we are required to have oversight over the contractor, and their drug and alcohol program is a good example of one of those oversights. So that's just a snippet of what it is we'll be focusing on throughout the process of choosing a contractor. Now, First Transit is our existing contractor, as most of you probably realize. And they, of course, plan on bidding, at least that's our understanding, on this next go-round. Now, this particular time, what we're doing is we're doing a 2-year contract with 3 one-year options going beyond that. So it's a little different than what we've done in the past, but we feel that gives us the flexibility should we need it for a variety of reasons. And one of them being, they get into the contract and it's not working out, or they can't handle certain things, or we feel from our side that there's other reasons that are outside the scope of something that the contractor would have control over that would impact the operations. So we decided to go with a 2-year with the 3 one-year options. Lori, I don't want to take all the time. Do you want to wrap it up with the rest?
Sure. Well, and I think the 2-year was also selected because of the Transit Authority study and whatever recommendations come from that. And when we become over 200,000 population and become a TMA, things might change. And so we wanted an opportunity to be able to incorporate those into what we're doing with our contracted services. So we have a pre-bid meeting today at 11:30 with anyone that's interested in bidding, and we have had 4 companies, I believe, who have requested copies of the proposals, and so that'll be today. And those on the evaluation team have been invited to participate if on that pre-bid if they want to. We will be getting out minutes of those as well and putting them on our procurement website so that people can see what occurred at that meeting. Let's see. We have selection criteria that are established with points that will evaluate proposals, and we will also choose to interview one or more of the bidders to get more information and ask questions. There will be brief presentations from the vendors today who are interested in bidding too, to see what those companies are about. And that's, I think, basically that's it. Because we weren't meeting as a committee, we did ask Commission and Council to send out that RFP so that we could get that going for the first of the year and contract for the first of the year. And so we'll be doing a pretty quick turnaround in negotiation. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions from the committee for Julie and Lori. A quick question on the RFPs. Is that a relatively small pool of companies that would bid on something like this? And how do you kind of get the message out, so to speak, or word out as far as that we're entertaining a new contract? What's kind of the process for kind of coming up with companies that would bid on something like this?
There are a set number of companies that have the ability to bid on this, and I think most of them have expressed an interest, and that's why we've had about 4 companies get our RFP. And what was your second question, Kevin?
Just, how do you kind of get the word out? So, as far as that there's.
Yeah. We have a trade magazine called Transit Talent that we put an advertisement in. That's a national trade magazine that vendors will look for. We also, published it locally, but we did do a national publication.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or discussion?
Mr. Chair, this is Lisa. I have a question or comment.
Yes, Lisa.
So I know that employee recruitment is a big issue, driver recruitment and things. And I was just wondering what the plan is. I mean, this would, if I were one of the transit employees, especially the dispatchers, now that the RFP is public, I would have questions about how this affects my job, even if it's just an issue of reassurance. So I was wondering what the plan is for communicating with the staff that are out on the road and serving the public.
This is Matt. I can take that one if you'd like.
Sure.
We actually talked about this yesterday, Julie, Lori, and I, and Jordan. Our plan is here at the beginning of October to go in and start meeting with the City of Fargo HR and the current dispatchers with First Transit. We did speak with First Transit yesterday as well. There does not seem to be any concerns that they are aware of. They seem to understand what's going on. Ultimately, all 4 dispatchers at First Transit would be offered a job with City of Fargo as a dispatcher. It will be up to them to decide if they want to come on to City of Fargo as a dispatcher, or if they want to see if First Transit has a different position that they would be interested in. But we'll start working with that group of people and our HR department here the next couple of weeks and getting things set up for a 2021 transition. Does that answer your question, Lisa?
I think so. I think the sooner the better if this information is out there.
Right, yep. No, I agree. And like I said, we did talk with First Transit a little bit yesterday. And correct me if I'm wrong, Julie or Lori, but it didn't sound like they had a lot of concerns. the dispatchers, they've known that we've been looking at doing something like this for a while and understood that, they would either transition or stay with First Trans or whatever they ultimately chose. But that is a timely process, and so we do need to start on that here in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, that I would echo that same sentiment. Our plan is to do a memo to address all the drivers, staff, anyone that's involved with the project. First Transit put out a memo yesterday just on a few items related to the process. But yeah, we all agree it's very important. We want to get that information out to them, which we'll do by the end of this week is my plan. So.
And just so you know, Lori, the drivers themselves will be offered jobs by whatever contractor is selected, and we have set those minimum wages in the RFP so that they'll be made whole. That they won't see a change. They may see more money, but they won't see less money and less benefits than what they currently have. So that transition can be easy if it does change from one contractor to another.
Yes.
Lauren, how long have we been with First Transit? Have we had any changes over the last several years?
Fargo's been with First Transit since 1997, and Fargo Moorhead have both been with them since 2007. So okay. We have had other bidders, but we have selected First Transit.
Yeah. Okay.
Process.
Yep.
Any other discussion or questions?
This is Sarah. I guess I have a question. Well, first of all, I want to thank Lisa for bringing up that really important point, because in such a insecure job market, reassuring people is really important. But I did have a question about the evaluation team and sort of the timeline for that. It's true, it's been a while since we have met back in January. Yeah. And I know we're have the pre-bid presentation today, and then it looks like later this September, or I guess it's September now, later this month, we'll be meeting again. Just for my own sense of time, what are we looking at? Thank you.
Proposals are due September 23rd, and then we have from September 24th to, I believe, October 7th to review and interview. So it's a fairly quick turnaround. We usually have a longer period of time to process all of this before the contract starts in January. But we wanted to wait and find out what Fargo was doing with the dispatchers in their budgeting process before we sent out the RFP. So it's a fairly short turnaround. So I think we sent out a doodle poll to the evaluation team. Hopefully everybody got that, so we could find out what schedule and try to get on your schedules as quickly as we could.
Thank you, that helps.
Other questions? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on our agenda item. Thanks for the update. We'll go on to the GTC renovation update, which is item 2C. Julie and Matt.
Okay, I can get started and Matt can take over on the technology pieces. So what we're doing at the Ground Transportation Center, GTC as we call it, and believe me, it's well overdue. That facility was built in 1983. And we've done one minor upgrade in 2004. Other than that, there's been absolutely nothing done as far as renovations go. And we outgrew the facility. So what we did was we had the facility study, which some of you may remember back in 2018, which identified several areas that needed attention, if you will. So that study also addressed the undergrade parking. Now, so there's a parking structure under the GTC, but that is not part of what we did for our project. The parking part of the organization for the city of Fargo are the ones that spearheaded that effort, but they used the same contractors we did. So KLJ is the oversight engineering firm, and we ended up with Gast Construction, Rick Electric, and Valley Services Mechanical to be the three main subs that we ended up using. So what was the goal of the renovation? Well, it was significant. What we decided was we were going to be phasing the project through and keep the operations going at the GTC. However, we knew that would add quite a bit of extra time, so we relocated over to 401 3rd Avenue North, which is the old public health building. And we will be there until this project is done. We anticipate the project being done and certificate of occupancy being issued here within the next week or so at the most. There's a little more work to do outside, so we're going to keep the buses at 401 3rd Avenue North until the end of September, but we will have some staff moving into the refurbished, renovated GTC. So what we're doing is, and I don't think those of you that are familiar with the internal part of it probably won't recognize it when you go in. There was a lot of empty space that we put to much better use. That we will be able to move our entire paratransit staff down there. And we are going to, of course, have our fixed route staff down there as far as dispatchers go. And once they become city employees, our goal long-term is to cross-train the fixed route and the paratransit dispatchers / reservationists, get that depth, if you will, of personnel that we will have available to perform those functions. So that's one of the goals. Matt Peterson is moving down there, our assistant transit director, so he'll be overseeing that site and a lot of the stuff that goes on down there. Cole is moving down there. He's our transit planner. And we've got, we'll have a Fargo police officer that will be, have a cubicle and station there. And we are also providing an office to our operations manager from First Transit. So it's going to be a good balance, and it's also going to give us some room, a little bit of breathing room out at the Metro Transit garage. So that was one of the goals, to kind of balance out the way the staff is set up and where they're located, and oversight, more boots on the ground, if you will, oversight from Matt and Cole being down at the GTC. So we did that. We replaced the lobby area and the lobby area ended up being larger than before we started the project, which kind of surprised all of us when they were able to do that. So we've increased our seating. We put our dispatch in the southeast corner, and they're right up in the window area so that they have great visibility when it comes to seeing the buses being pulled in, backed out, pedestrian movements, bikes, everybody coming and going. They're going to have a much better visual on what's going on outside. So that was one of our main goals. We did take down the large bus stanchions, and our goal for next spring, using the rest of our grants that are available, is to finish the exterior so that we can have the proper bus movement, and we're going to pull back the canopy a little bit so the buses can pull in and filter through that way. The canopy currently is in place. We've had several issues with it, one of them being the lighting. When it's dark out or it's dusk, you're having a lot of reflection. The dispatchers have a real struggle seeing what's going on. So we wanted to improve that for them. We wanted to pull back on it also to allow more space, like I said, for the buses to pull in and out. But it was also interfering with our GPS signals. So some of our equipment that should be operating at that time wasn't operating properly. So all of those issues will be resolved when we get the exterior finished to do that. So some of the technical stuff, we had to have the expansion joint replaced. What's an expansion joint was my question. And it goes all the way around the perimeter, and it's actually just kind of a bow-shaped piece of material that would stretch all the way around the perimeter of the facility. And it's filled in with a kind of an epoxy, and it expands and contracts as weather changes and patterns come through. So it's critical that we have that done. And that's what we're having. They're finishing that up here the last 2 weeks in September. So thus the delay in actually opening it and putting buses on that deck. We want to just give them the opportunity to finish, get everything ready, and then we'll open up after that. So we did change out the main lobby entrance. You won't recognize it when you're coming in. And we've got the whole restroom setup. Everything is different, but it's great. And we put well, it used to be Greyhound. I keep calling them that, but it's Jefferson now. We built a spot for Jefferson. They're leasing space from us. So their operations will continue to come in and out of the GTC. And we've got spots for them flowing in, flowing out. And their area is, I was just down there yesterday. It looks great. Everything is put together nicely. You know, of course, it's an old building, but when you walk in, it looks fresh. It looks clean. It looks very inviting for everyone. So I think people will be very happy to see us open back up. And I'm going to let Matt talk any technology. I don't mean to monopolize time, and I'd be happy to answer questions when Matt's done, if you have any.
So I don't have a lot. Just Julie pretty much covered everything. We are planning to open the facility on October 1st. So starting right away, October 1st, we will have the building open to the public, and we'll have buses coming through the lot. September 30th is our drop dead deadline for the contractor, so to speak. With that being said, we do have cameras already set up in there. I did create a video that's on our website that kind of shows or documents the progress of the construction project. So if any of you were able to see that, and then we kind of went overkill on some of the technology pieces. I shouldn't say overkill, but we have a lot of areas where we can set up kiosks and TVs and different things like that, so that information we can push out digitally or electronically, which has been very beneficial. So ultimately, we won't have it all set up until we start getting our staff down there. And like Julie said, we plan on doing that here in the next week or so once we get that certificate of occupancy, which will hopefully be this week. I've been saying that for the last 3. Then once we get in there, we get that stuff set up. We have a conference room down there that can be used for meetings downtown that will be fully virtually accessible. So there'll be webcams, audio, TVs, things like that in there for presentations. Can be used for some driver training if need be, and just some different meetings that we have planned for the future. So that's kind of where we're at with the technology piece.
Did you want to mention the access to any Wi-Fi or USB charging or any of that, Matt, that we're providing? Or?
Yeah, so we did put in all of this lobby seating does have USB charging ports now, since we find that a lot of our passengers are trying to get into the outlets and plug different things in. So when we put the new seating in, we did put USB plugins in, very similar to what you would see in an airport. And then the Wi-Fi access, that is still up for debate as to whether or not we plan on opening up a public Wi-Fi access similar to what's at City Hall. However, we do have multiple networks down there now, so that we can get, currently, if we request a video on one of our vehicles, we have to wait for it to come back to the MPG at the end of the evening, so at 11 o'clock. Now the buses will be able to access that network while they're at GTC, and it can download that video throughout the day as they come through. So we have quicker access to the video and incident reporting mechanisms. Along with our new fare boxes, which I keep forgetting about because we're fare free through the end of the year. However, with the new fare boxes, we have Wi-Fi capabilities so that we can get real-time ridership numbers as the buses pull into GTC as well. So those are a couple of the other back-end updates that are really nice from an admin point of view for us to be able to access data.
Thank you.
Okay, questions for Julie and Matt on their update?
This is Steve Lindos.
Just a quick question
Go ahead, Sarah. You go first.
This is the hardest part about virtual meetings. Matt mentioned there was a video of the new space. Is it? I was looking at the YouTube page. There's like a 4-month-old one. Where is the new updated images? That would be great to share with the public.
Yeah, so it is. It is on YouTube. It's also on our. It was on our website. Let me look here.
Maybe just sharing a link with us afterwards would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll do that. And then there'll be one more video coming out. So the first video was the demolition. The second video was kind of before they started painting, but the walls were up. And then the last video now will be with all the furniture and the painting and everything done. So I just kind of keep compiling on top of the others. But yeah, I'll definitely share a link with you guys.
So Councilmember Watson Curry had my exact question. It was answered. Then the other aspect of it is with pandemic issues, you can't have a big, huge, grand opening celebration. So, is there kind of a virtual grand opening with that, especially with the third video planned, or at least a big announcement?
Yeah, so we kind of got back and forth with this a little bit. Sorry, Julie, you want to take this one?
No, go ahead. You started.
We plan on having some sort of a grand opening once we get in there. It's not going to be to the level that we would like to see just because of the COVID. Grand Forks had something similar back in, was it July, Julie?
Yes.
August? And they had some really good ideas on how to do that. They met outside, they kept doors open. Face masks will be required whenever coming into the building for both passengers or anyone for that matter. So we do plan on doing something. We just don't have all of the final details yet. The video will be a big part of it. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah. Nope, you got it.
Any other questions? All right, thank you for the update. We'll move on to our agenda, item 2D, which is the Matt Bus Transit Authority study. Michael has a memo in your packet, which was agenda item 2D. Michael, were you going to introduce the topic, or do you want us to go right to Joseph?
Yeah, I'll introduce. So, as most of you all know, and maybe some of the new members don't, MetroCog, Matt Bus, and SRF have been working towards completing a transit authority study, which looks at both organizational structure and funding opportunities after this area becomes a transportation management area, which is that designation when we reach over 200,000 population. And there are a number of changes to some of the operating rules that MutBus will have to comply with, and that kind of pushed us to looking at different organizational structures and different ways of gaining revenue. And with that, I'll just introduce the project manager from SRF Consulting Group, Joseph Capper, and he'll be giving a presentation on some of the findings of the plan today.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to click on Start Presentation, I believe, and that'll share my screen. Can everybody see a slideshow?
Yep.
Very good. Well, good morning. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. What I'll be covering today is a condensed and updated version of a presentation that we gave to the Policy Advisory Committee a few weeks ago. We are in the home stretch of putting together our authority report and finalizing our recommendations and making sure we have all the details we need. But what I'll be covering today is a review of, particularly for some of the new folks, a little bit of an introduction of the overall project. And then what I want to get into is a lot of the key recommendations, both for what we think are the most promising governance alternatives, and then some of the funding alternatives for the Transit Authority study. And then we'll talk about some of the key steps for implementation, what things will look like in the next 1 to 3 years. And then I'll invite any questions from the group. Before I get into the presentation, I also do want to put in a little bit of a plug. We will be sending out an invitation very soon, hopefully today, for a brown bag specifically for policymakers. I know it's been hard to kind of get everybody at the same place at the same time over the course of this project, but we want to make sure that everyone, particularly the folks on this call, are engaged and have all their questions answered while we are still under contract in specifically. So, that'll be a chance. We'll have all the report documents and memos ready. We can dig into any details we need to. So that is another opportunity to be involved in the project and have input and have your questions answered in addition to this presentation today. So a little bit of background, what Michael mentioned, why are we here? Why are we doing a transit authority study? We're building on work that has already been completed. There was an initial phase of this work that was completed in 1999, and also a recommendation from the most recent transit development plan in 2016 to pursue this study. We're acknowledging that Matt Bus is a growing transit system in a growing region. So the transit need will be increasing, and there's probably going to be a corresponding funding need for that. And then probably the biggest catalyst for this, as Michael mentioned, are the funding implications following the 2020 census, where we will be moving into a different category of federal aid that has implications for how you can use federal dollars and also the amount of federal dollars that will come into the Fargo-Moorhead region. Just a little bit of a rundown of that. After the census is released, we are anticipating growth of over that 200,000 population tier, and that affects primarily, the biggest impacts are on these 3 programs. So FTA Section 5307, which is the federal formula dollars that come into the region, that are, in some cases, are passed through state DOTs now in the governor's apportionment. Now it will go to, you're competing in a different pool of money, and that has implications. There's a change in the funding that you get through what's called STIC, or transit intensive cities. It's something that helps the performance of cities with that have high ridership. I think typically mid-sized urban communities with university presence, with a good university presence, they perform well because of the ridership base that affects, that can actually bring more federal dollars into the region. That would change under the new funding categorization. And then Section 5339 is the capital funding formula, and that will also change. After doing substantial engagement over the past year and a half, I think we wanted to make sure we're addressing some of these key issues as we make recommendations. So all of our recommendations ultimately will tie back to this. There's broad consensus that we want to improve communication among partner agencies, staff, and management, improve decision-making processes, and have an equitable funding formula or process by which decisions are made, funding decisions are decided, that is better than what we have now. So breaking down a lot of the silos that exist, a lot of the communication issues that exist, and just having so many different decision points, whether it's city councils or commissions, regional governing bodies, everything that we'd like to find ways to streamline and eliminate those risk points. Ultimately, we also want to address the funding gap that exists, which I'll let you know what our assumptions are a little bit later in the presentation, and then also give after our contract is up, make sure you have a good roadmap for what the different steps are and who is responsible for implementation. So without further ado, I will get into the recommended governance alternatives. So this project has 2 tracks. I'll be giving an overview of what, based on our engagement and research, what we believe to what are the most promising alternatives for governance changes, and then also funding, and then how those merge together. So we've organized the governance alternatives into 2 categories. One is the longer term recommendation, which is establishing a North Dakota Transit Authority. This would be a new government agency that would be based in the North Dakota portion of the MAT bus service area. Ideally, it would have some local taxing authority or a local funding source that goes into it. We are recommending that it certainly covers Fargo and West Fargo, with the options to expand contracted services out. I'll talk a little bit about why we're recommending it on the North Dakota side, but we're also, how it would work is that Moorhead, for example, would purchase transportation from this North Dakota authority. We do acknowledge that in order to make something like this happen, it requires enabling legislation from the state of North Dakota, and that there are several different risk points moving forward. Because of that, we want to make sure that we are addressing some of those other issues related to communication, decision-making, and policy. So we've also provided an interim recommendation, which is basically centralizing management of MATBus under a single transit director. Our recommendation is that position is housed, maybe not physically housed, but it would be an employee of MetroCog, given that MetroCog is already a regional organization that has transportation as part of its mission. This would help with unifying the visioning for MATBus, long-term planning, decision-making, and having a dedicated staff person to oversee the overall operation, but also forge some of these agreements that need to take place and advance the development of an authority. So some of the details on that long-term recommendation, what are we recommending here for the North Dakota Authority? As I mentioned, it would be a new government agency requiring North Dakota enabling legislation. This is not intended to layer another system of decision making on top of what is already there. Ultimately, the local governments would still have autonomy related to their funding, but the overall oversight of the system would be reallocated to an authority. We would like it to have taxing authority so that it has the ability to address some of the funding gaps that are out there. And we also use this as a foundation that could be expanded to a bi-state authority. We acknowledge that having a true regional bi-state unified transit authority has a lot of advantages and is a really good option. Just given the time frame and the number of changes that would need to happen, we view just having a one on the North Dakota side, that would be a more, I think it's a little bit more feasible given the time frame. But I guess the long-term recommendation would be to continue pursuit of this bi-state effort. Why do we have 2 alternatives here? Why not stop at the interim solution? Well, centralizing management and reorganizing how it's governed definitely has a lot of advantages, but that alone doesn't solve the funding gap. It doesn't really provide any new funding mechanisms beyond what we have right now that would draw revenues at a level necessary to address some of the gaps that we could be facing. But those communications and governance issues are very important, and we wanted to make sure that they were addressed. If aside from the funding issue, it came up in almost every meeting we had, whether it's staff, decision makers, that we want to make sure we're doing things in a little bit more of a streamlined fashion. As I mentioned, why not a bi-state authority? I think we are linking back to those initial goals and objectives. And the North Dakota portion of the service area has the greatest pressure for expansion and also the most significant funding shortfall because of just how state funding is arranged and the scale of the system on the North Dakota side. So there's a little bit more of a sense of urgency of figuring out, hey, how are we going to fill in this funding gap on the North Dakota side? Not to say that there won't also be one on the Minnesota side of the service area, but it's just not as significant. Also, it has the potential to simplify processes with the city of Moorhead, clarify their role in the system as basically purchasing transportation from this North Dakota authority. And as I mentioned, it doesn't preclude the eventual formation of a bi-state authority. The overall purpose of this authority would be to provide independence for the transit agency and solve issues at a regional scale as opposed to a local one. We really want to unify visioning, long-term planning, and decision-making so that it is a cohesive regional vision. And also this potentially simplifies and improves communication and coordination for some of this decision-making. And ultimately levy a new stable funding source that'll help the transit system be more resilient as we move forward. It would be the governance and decision making would be by a transit authority board. Our thought would be that the makeup of the board here today would be a great starting point for what a transit authority board would look like. We want to make sure there's representation from all funding partners, and that there would be a single transit director position that would report to that board. The question has come up quite a bit of what would happen to existing MATBus staff. There is plenty of work that needs to be done at MATBus. This is not a consolidation or replacement effort, particularly as you move into this new funding category. The reporting responsibilities get even higher. There are certain activities that state DOTs handle, for example, that would then fall on the local local or regional transit authority. So, this is not by any means a replacement, but a reallocation of responsibilities. The management staff would eventually be hired by the transit authority. The transit authority would oversee the operations contract that was discussed at the top of this meeting, and also manage any kind of staff transitions or reorganization that may need to happen. This is just a laundry list of what the scope and responsibility of the transit authority would be when we're starting to get into bylaws and the details of what we want to make sure is included in any sort of legislative package. A lot of it is what I mentioned earlier, but ultimately there would be an appointed or elected authority board of directors. They are kind of responsible for the strategic plan, operating agreement, various assets that may need to be transferred. I'll get into that a little bit later as we talk about implementation. And ultimately we just wanted to outline all the details of what a transit authority would be responsible for. How this links then to funding for both the interim and long-term models, there would still be a series of service agreements that would need to happen. Multi-year would be preferable, but they would be reviewed annually. You want to make sure that we're corresponding as best as we can to the different funding cycles, grant and funding cycles that are out there. The service agreements don't necessarily dictate the level of service that is planned at a regional level, but rather membership in the MATBus system. So we're looking at a potential minimum membership for a partner agency, and the governing board would ultimately be responsible for day-to-day and long-range service planning decisions. We also want to make sure that there's requirements for notice of withdrawal from the board, so that the transit director can adequately budget and plan for the system. Local share of expenses would still be the responsibility of jurisdictions receiving transit service. Again, I think we're looking at a system that is potentially expanding, although, you know, in present times may delay that a little bit, but long term the need is still out there. And we do acknowledge that some funding options can be implemented without an authority. A little bit more detail on the interim recommendation. What do we mean by bringing MatBus into MetroCog oversight and hiring a central manager? The ability here is to provide independence for the transit agency to solve regional issues, as opposed to relying on multiple parallel, at times conflicting local processes to manage a single what is a single regional system. This would unify the visioning, long-term planning, and decision-making. We would hope improve communication and coordination, which in turn minimizes risk. And the reason why we're going to MetroCog is that they're already a bi-state agency. The member communities are already engaged in MetroCog, and it is also has a history of housing and operating the region's transit system. Some of the elements of what this new director position would entail, as I mentioned, an employer of MetroCog, they report to the executive director and the MetroCog policy board. That's a primary venue for local government partner input. We view them as a chief executive officer for transit to oversee and coordinate a lot of the decision making today. A key negotiator with municipalities and community partners for those local funding agreements, and centralize things as a single point of contact for operations approvals and proposals. They would also ultimately be charged with hiring decisions. Some of that could certainly be delegated to other management staff as needed. We don't want to necessarily overload this position with responsibilities. That can be bad too. But I think the key here is that they have a regional mandate rather than a local one. We are looking at ultimately being governed by the MetroCog Policy Board, advised by the Transportation Technical Committee. So this new director position would direct and oversee performance of MatBus staff. They'd have the first recommendation on hiring, career compensation, kind of all the administrative details would be the responsibility of this position. Again, could be delegated to other management staff too, just as needed as the organizational chart develops and as we get closer to implementation. Again, the question of what happens to existing MatBus staff, there are many different options. None are necessarily right or wrong, but we are part of this study report will outline a process by which we can move forward. They can remain employees of the cities of Fargo and Moorhead, or they could be rehired by MetroCog. There are several different paths that you'd want to take. I think there's no need to necessarily make huge changes right now, but if long-term a transit authority becomes infeasible, you might want to reevaluate where the existing city positions are housed. The director would also be responsible for managing the transition to a North Dakota authority. We do outline which staff would be responsible for that, and establish how important it is to establish a working group among local leadership in the North Dakota municipalities. So that is an overview of our recommendations for the governance alternatives. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how those tie into funding. So just so we start off on the same page, the assumptions that we're working with is that once we transition to a TMA, we're looking at a 1.2 million operating funding gap, knowing what we know today. And that just assumes fall 2019 levels of operations. The largest portion of that funding gap consists of federal dollars that are designated for the North Dakota portion of the MAT bus service area. It is our understanding that the state of Minnesota intends to commit funding in a similar share of operating expenses to the Moorhead side. Now, that is highly dependent on the current legislation being what it is. We don't necessarily anticipate any changes, but that is everything here is assuming. I say everything in this report is assuming what we know today. Things could change in the future, and I think it's also important to note that as the system expands, even if we do get these funding sources, there is still a likelihood of an increased local share commitments, which is why we're outlining a number of funding mechanisms. We also looked at growth scenarios that were identified in some benchmarks that were identified in the 2018 facility study, and that we're also looking at in the transit development plan right now. That assumes a 21% increase in service by the year 2027 and a 43% increase in service by 2037. That may change, and these are things that will probably be refined as we work through the current TDP, but we wanted to get a sense of how system growth, not just continuity of operations, would affect funding and which funding mechanisms would be best suited to meet the requirements of that growth. Capital funding is also an important part of this, and that's something that we're working through right now to make sure we're including adequately in the report. The changes in capital funding largely result from two elements. One is the change in when you go into a TMA, you are limited to how much of that 5307 money you can use for operating dollars. So some of that 5307 pot gets shifted into capital. There is also a change in the FTA 5339 funding tier. So that is the formula capital dollars for bus and bus facilities that would come directly into the Fargo-Moorhead region. So we're looking at about $530,000 in federal capital assistance each year that would come in at an 80% share. That in some cases is an increase of where we were before, but it depends on how you look at it, because the majority of that money results from a shift in operating dollars. So it's not necessarily a lot more money, it's just more money designated for capital. And it does require that 20% local match. So when we're looking at different funding mechanisms, there were several different evaluation criteria and considerations that we went through. One is the annual revenue potential for each one and the ability to address that funding gap, how easy they would be to implement. For example, the need for local or state legislation, how equitable they are, and being non-regressive, and how we can apply fairness to each geography in the region, and then outlining what some of the economic risks are. So, for example, a sales tax is highly dependent on economic swings up and down. Which revenue sources position you best for resilience moving forward? We established for each of these funding mechanisms that we researched an estimate of annual revenues between 2023 and 2027. What is their ability to replace or supplement existing mechanisms? The ability to support expanded transit service identified in some of those plans I mentioned earlier. What are the outcomes of a 20-year funding horizon? And then how easily can we use these funding sources to match other sources and leverage aid into the region? We also presented these different sources to the TAC for input, and in some cases, we're still working with city staff to get some refined recommendations and figures for each of these. In some earlier presentations, we went into the nuts and bolts of all these funding mechanisms in pretty great detail. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that today, but this is the list of what we looked at. We looked at the potential for a fare increase, advertising revenue, local property tax levy, establishing a fee for TNCs. So some regions have put together a fee for Uber and Lyft that operates in their region as a revenue generator. We looked at an income tax, a transit utility fee, and then also establishing a transit assessment district, regional property tax, and a sales tax. We also looked at some other revenue sources that maybe didn't meet some of our criteria, but we wanted to include as possibilities, either that they required significant changes to state legislation, or they didn't necessarily collect enough revenue, but would be an important component of the system. Some of those are things that you do right now. For example, advertising, concessions, and vending. Those are not insignificant revenue sources for the system, and we recommend that they should be continued. And we also did outline some things that are used in other communities that would require legislation here, but we wanted to make sure as just a policy recommendation they were included. Those included county wheel taxes, a local gas tax, or having on-street parking fees or other parking revenues go toward transit. So our conclusion is that there is no single financial alternative that is perfect. If whether it's because you would be over leveraged into one funding source, or it would just take the administrative and legislative burden would be too significant. So we do recommend having a diverse set of funding sources and utilizing as many of these as possible moving forward. But we're looking at a sales tax or a property tax millage or some combination of both that has the greatest potential to address the current and future funding needs. Our recommendation is that an approach would be to pursue this as a long-term solution while implementing several of those other, maybe smaller funding sources locally in the interim to keep shoring up more revenue. I'll have this discussion question at the end, but I would very much appreciate feedback from policymakers if this is something that has been discussed locally, or if you have any questions about that. To conclude, I'll talk a little bit about what we view as the roadmap for implementation. These things operate on 3 tracks. There's the governance track, management and operations, and then funding. Working toward appointing an authority board, determining the details of how representation works on that board, and then answering any questions related to asset and facility ownership or potential lease agreements that might need to happen. For management and operations, that's probably the first thing that needs to be done, is looking at that hiring of that central transit director position and putting things in that person's position description and updating current position descriptions at MatBus. For funding, also working with city staff primarily, as well as state legislatures to get a package ready that can ensure stable long-term funding for the MatBus system. We have outlined these into phased development, so year 1, year 2, and year 3, for how this could flow together most easily, and also identifying the responsibility for individuals to move these things forward. A little bit more detail on the transition process. Who is involved? This new transit director, MetroCog Policy Board, MetroCog staff, and local leadership in North Dakota who work with the state legislature to address some of these issues and bring forth the authorities that we would need. Drafting a transit authority strategic plan, I think, is a very good idea. Some of these items we will be taking care of in the current transit development plan effort, but we want to make sure that that we identify these consensus issues that we are addressing with this authority. Revisiting funding splits for shared capital purchases, facility and asset investments, and also providing further detail and on the decision-making responsibility and communicating the benefits of each. We're looking at drafting operating agreements between Moorhead, Dilworth, and the Transit Authority, and all those other and everything that would come along with that. And also looking at the potential to draft operating agreements with West Fargo and Horace if those communities are not included within the Transit Authority's jurisdiction for whatever reason in the legislative process. These are some of the tasks that we've outlined as the initial phase of implementation. Any sort of asset transfer agreement that we need to happen, which may not need to happen, but that should be addressed. And then looking at confirming the authority's purchase of certain shares of ownership. Again, these are more long-term issues as an authority gets further developed. We are working with FTA right now on working out some of the details of what some of the changes, getting confirmation of what some of the changes would be as we go into a TMA, and what some of the eligible activities and considerations are that we would need to have. And then also finalizing details of drafting an organizational structure, board composition. These are all things that are included as a recommendation in the study report. We're also looking at finalizing that preferred financial alternative, making that part of the implementation plan, figuring out a way of collecting revenue, and then also determining some backup policies. I think what will happen if there is no legislative support? We can't form an authority. We can't raise additional revenues. That is a consideration as well. So we want to have these backstops included in the study report. We are also in the process right now of a lot of questions have come up for legal review. We do have a law firm on retainer. There are a couple of questions. We're also working with the City of Fargo's attorney's office on home rule questions. What is possible in today's framework regarding to property tax levies, millages, things like that. But most specifically, we want to make sure that we have legal review of MetroCog to fund, own, and manage transit service, what falls within their abilities, what may need to be changed. And also a confirmation that we have a good understanding of what the legal barriers currently are to authority development. The other item that we're looking at with the law firm is just we've provided some example legislation from other states. There are other states that we've worked with that have put forth new state laws to form transit authorities, and we're looking to see if there's any parity between that and North Dakota, what processes might need to happen. So that is my overview of our recommendations for the authority study. I'd be happy to have any discussion right now or answer any questions that may come from the group.
Joseph, this is John Strand calling. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, John.
I'm just curious if you have any sense of our ability regionally to tap into community development block grant funds.
So that's definitely something we can look into. And if anyone else on the call here has some insight on that, I have seen community development block grant funds used for capital projects, where there's a shared mission between transit, housing, some of the community development objectives of those grants before. I am not sure, how that would fit into supporting transit operating assistance for certain projects. It's not something I'm necessarily familiar with, but it's certainly something we could look into.
Deb.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for the presentation. I do have some real concerns about the shift to a single state authority and some of the possible consequences of that. One of them being the state funding from Minnesota. As you mentioned, you feel as though, it should remain stable, although there could be legislative changes. But if have you taken into consideration the impact of having just a sole North Dakota authority and how that might impact the funding that's available? Because I know that while we often see our partnerships across the, on each side of the river as being fairly seamless, the state of Minnesota doesn't necessarily see it that way. And we've had examples where funding sources or programs that we wanted to gain access to that aren't truly housed in Minnesota or truly have a strong presence in Minnesota, we're no longer eligible for. And so one of my big concerns would be that by making this strictly a North Dakota authority where we're not, it seems to me that I could easily see this being read as we're not truly partners, we're clients. And we would then no longer be eligible for some of the funding that we're currently receiving from the state of Minnesota by making this. And that would be really detrimental to Moorhead and Dilworth. Sure.
So let me provide a clarification on that for you. So what I would say is you are correct that the state of Minnesota isn't going to make a grant to the city of Fargo, for example, but they will still have a significant amount of state funding that would be that the intent would be to invest in the Minnesota portion of the service area. So there would still likely need to be a grant made to the city of Moorhead, where that's would be the pass through for the state and local funding, which could then be used through a purchase transportation agreement with a North Dakota with a North, we can call it whatever we want, the new transit authority that would oversee Matt Bus. As long as that investment is an equivalent and that the state of Minnesota is getting a return on that for the Minnesota portion of the service area, I wouldn't necessarily see any issue with that. There would still be, that autonomy on the Moorhead side of setting funding and service levels and then paying into that contractual agreement with the authority. So, and we've gotten, based on what we know today, we think funding levels will continue at the same level. There would just need to be some type of reporting or allocation plan that locally you need to provide to MnDOT to show that this is an investment that is going into transit service in the Minnesota side of the border. But other than that, we are not aware of a barrier that would be in place. It would still be, the city of Moorhead would still be a pass through of that funding.
Other questions? Annie?
I'm curious to know kind of what input you've gotten from local folks about the appetite for adding tax to support transit. I know there's bonding bills that have been passed in school districts. There's special assessments, diversion taxes. So I'm just curious kind of where or how much work has been done to understand what that local appetite is for an openness to adding something.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to minimize the challenge of, potentially adding, raising taxes or putting new taxing authority on there. I think what has been incumbent upon us is trying to clearly communicate the benefits of doing this, which will make it that much easier. I know in conversations with City of Fargo, for example, I think there is room within property tax levies and property tax millages to raise some funding to support this. The concept of a sales tax has been brought up. I don't know that there's as much of an appetite for that. But I think there's certainly an openness at the local level to it. But, I know that, these things can be fraught, and especially if you're relying on the state for assistance, it could be a challenge, but it is what your peer regions have done, I guess, to weather the burden of the funding change, because, knowing what we know under the current federal transportation bill, which could change, I mean, there's no way that we're not seeing a significant decline in federal aid coming in. So I would hope that that applies a little bit of a sense of urgency to it. And we provided we try to provide a broad, number of options that can be combined too, so that, we're not necessarily relying on a huge, sales tax hike on top of what we have to do to be the only thing. I think the idea is that, it's using maybe having one significant funding source that we're looking at applying, but it's complemented by several others.
Yeah, Joe, and just to add on to that too, and that's kind of why we have the interim solution the way that we do, is that we know that given the culture in this area, that adding new taxes that would be directly used for transit service might be difficult and might take a while to implement. And so still relying on the jurisdictions for their dedicated funding source through property taxes, and just having an interim leader kind of to coalesce planning and work towards that ultimate long-range goal would be something that we could utilize, whether it be for a short period of time or a longer period of time, given the infeasibility of adding new funding sources.
This is Brad. Let's say we are a TMA and we do not form a transit authority. What hurdles would MapBus have at that point if we did nothing and just let it keep going the same way? Where would we be at a couple of years down the road?
So, we would be looking at a pretty significant budget reduction, because it's not just the federal, that $1.2 million is not just the decrease in federal aid. That is inclusive of local matching funds as well. So, we could translate that into what that looks like for revenue hours. But it's it would result in likely a significant reduction in service if no additional revenues are brought into the system. I would invite anyone for either Michael or someone from MapBus to comment on that too, what that would look like.
In our conversations, at least with the city of Fargo, it doesn't seem like an insurmountable gap to overcome in this, in the current year when we become a TMA. However, as the region grows and has transit service would hopefully grow with the region, that gap becomes more pronounced. And so, we're looking at if nothing were to happen, let's say, and we just kind of continued on status quo, as the region grows, transit service stays about exactly the way that it is today. I mean, I would say that would be the reality of doing nothing. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe transit staff.
No, I would agree. I mean, if we did nothing, it would, it's all about budgets, funding, where we can find the revenue. And so I don't know that there would be really any improvements or expansions to transit if we did nothing.
If I could just add, I think the advantage of why we're looking at both governance and funding, a lot of these funding sources, for example, could be implemented by an individual municipality. It could just be the city of Fargo, for example, that gets a funding mechanism that they can address their share of the funding gap in the current system, or the same thing for the city of Moorhead. But what that doesn't necessarily do is change what we heard as being some of the communication, governance oversight issues. So the advantage of forming an authority is that you're able to address some of those challenges in parallel with each other. But there are a lot of different ways to do it, I guess. And I think what we're outlining here is based on what we heard, these are the best options.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask a follow-up question along those lines too. So, because I know the taxing issue has come up in several different meetings, and I know that one of the questions around that was raised is that, currently we know that there's very different models in North Dakota than there is in Minnesota, and that, on the Minnesota side, we're taxed at a higher level, and then, that goes to the state, but we get more back from them in terms of funding for our transportation. And so I know we've, made the point of we're already paying the tax. And so there was concern if we had a transit authority that was, that was able to implement a tax, would it be the same with the tax level, the rate that we were, whatever tax we use, would it be the same on the Minnesota side as it was on the North Dakota side, which would seem as though then we would be paying taxes that we'd be paying in addition to the taxes that we're already paying. And I thought in those conversations, we were told that if we did have a transit authority that encompassed both states, we could, if we chose to do that, wouldn't have to be something that was applied universally across the whole district, that we could have different, we might not tax at the same, have the same tax in Moorhead as we did in Fargo. So that's one part. But then now, if we're looking at only a North Dakota based, does that preclude any taxing possibility? You would have no jurisdiction to be able to tax on the Minnesota side, correct? So, but that would also mean that for Moorhead and Dilworth, that's not an opportunity that we could use to cover our share, because we would have to find other. So when you're talking about this is just one source that we could use, that would be an option that is not available under this model on the Minnesota side. Is that correct?
So if I can speak to the first part of your, I think that your first part of the question is that kind of gets at why having just a single state authority rose to the top. Was that, there were the gap is much more significant on the North Dakota side. Plus, you mentioned the difference in tax rates on the Minnesota side. Those were things that we heard at the outset. That I guess the locally there, a lot of those different funding mechanisms that we outlined could certainly be implemented to cover. There will also be a funding gap on the Moorhead side as well, albeit less significant. I would certainly say we wouldn't preclude that from happening. That would be a local decision, I guess, as to how you'd want to do that. And I think to form an authority, there would also need to be some legislative solution as well on the Minnesota side. What we did look at very closely as a kind of a parallel model to this is what they do in Duluth Superior. It's just kind of the reverse. So Duluth Transit Authority would be kind of the equivalent of what we'd be proposing for Fargo, where the city of Superior in Wisconsin has a seat on the DTA board, but they just basically buy transportation from DTA and are still responsible for that local funding commitment, however they want to do it. But it's the same thing where the state aid passes through the city of Superior is the grantee for DTA from Wisconsin DOT. And they do have something there is in the Minnesota state legislature, specific naming of the Duluth Transit Authority. So we would envision something similar to that. But yeah, I wouldn't say this study does not recommend that the Moorhead side cannot implement any of these potential funding solutions. I think that would only be more helpful. Ultimately, it was a method of setting priorities, is why we set it up the way we did.
Yeah, and to Councilperson White, we've conversed with the state of Minnesota throughout this process, and even though I don't know where we sit now after the whole pandemic, the state of Minnesota did commit to funding the city of Minnesota, or the city of Moorhead, transit service, and possibly fill in a lot of the gap that would be present. I don't know where that sits now, because we know that state revenues are down, given everything that's gone on with COVID. But we also know that the state of Minnesota has a lot of transit goals that they want us to increase service already, and they are willing to pay or willing to help institute some of those services. So that's already something that we've been planning for over the last couple of years, with Sunday service or later night Saturday service, or things of that nature. And so I think there's been that push for years on the Minnesota side to increase service, to increase frequencies, to have all those services for citizens. Where on the North Dakota side, there really hasn't been. So I think that's a little bit the reason why there's a little bit of a lopsided approach on the North Dakota and Minnesota side. Not to saying, like Joe said, though, like in the long term, it may make more sense to also extend the authority into the Minnesota side, but maybe taking get this implemented and then work on the other side is maybe a better approach.
So I do appreciate that, and I understand. I just wanted to, though, make sure that I'm correct on this. So if the single state authority was developed, then the option for local taxing authority would not be available for the Minnesota side. You would only be able to tax, so that, not that we would necessarily want to, but it just would not be an option to be able to use that as a funding source on the Minnesota side.
Correct.
This is Lisa. Is it also true, though, that if if Moorhead or Minnesota, determined its own, we're buying service from the North Dakota Authority anyway, so we could determine whatever funding source best suits our needs to purchase what we're purchasing. Is that kind of that's how I process it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. The city already has the ability to levy property tax, and so given the political wants and needs of the community, the city would have that opportunity.
And I also just want to speak a little bit to the intent of that setup. The idea is that there's still like a cohesive regional planning process. So it's not like there wouldn't be this scenario where the city of Moorhead would purchase from this transit authority. Oh, here's the calendar year 2024 service scope for Moorhead that is completely different than what we had before, or flies in the face of what's in a TDP. I think there would still that's not a realistic, or what we hope is not a realistic outcome here. That there's still a planning process in place, and while there is that autonomy in what what the Minnesota communities would purchase and their decision making and funding decisions, that is still born out of a regional planning process, so that the services are integrated and things work operationally very well.
Absolutely. It doesn't take the jurisdictional approval away, though. I think of it more as the way we try to operate for the public right now is MAT bus rather than City of Moorhead and City of Fargo. And this would be taking it one step further where there's more integration of the authority. But there is still jurisdictional, considerations and things like what do we want in our city?
Joseph, question on the capital acquisition. Right now, the state of Minnesota, as far as purchasing buses, under this new concept where Moorhead has sold its share, so to speak, to the transit authority, how would Moorhead, when it busing acquisition, new buses, how do you envision that working as far as Minnesota being able to fund Moorhead's desire for buses? Obviously, they're going to just have a service contract, a little bit different concept than we have today.
There would be some type of a cost allocation plan, most likely. I think the idea is that we're moving more in a direction of shared assets versus the different siloed ones. I don't think that there is any barrier to continuing to grant capital funding from either state into the region. But what I will say is that where capital funding now currently comes from, it's a state pass through. Instead, you'll have that direct relationship with FTA going into the region. So where I think that concern would be with any state matching funds that go into capital funding, but the federal dollars are now going to be it's going to be that direct relationship with FTA. So that's something that we're looking at a smaller pot of discretionary money that would be coming from the state of Minnesota at this point. And I think the spirit of it is that, well, we're assuming that a regional bi-state organization, they would be coordinating service, that we're not just keeping Minnesota buses on the Minnesota side of the border and the like, but that you're using it in a way that is most operationally efficient. So I would think that there would still be support for that. You could still tap into state grants for the service. I think it would just be, you'd have to work with your representatives at Minnesota DOT to make sure that you're communicating that there is a benefit to the Minnesota side of the border, and it would function much like you would with a facility or something like that, where they'd still be able to fund a portion of that service. But the big difference is the federal funding is coming through. You have that it'll be directly from FTA now.
Yeah, and
into the
just
region.
And just to solidify MetroCog's role in kind of regional transit planning, through the newest iteration of our MTP, we have dedicated quote unquote highway funds to the replacement of rolling stock moving forward. After this region becomes a TMA, MetroCog will receive a direct allocation of Surface Transportation Block Grant Program funds. And we've looked at, dedicating a proportion of those funds to transit. And so MetroCog is leveraging, quote, regional funds to help kind of fill some of the gap in as far as some of those capital expenditures.
Other questions or discussion? Matthew, I believe there's or Michael, there's a recommended motion, a resolution of support at the bottom of your memo on item 2D that you would like the committee to look at and recommend?
Yeah, correct. So just a little bit on the approval process. We are looking to move forward with approval of this plan at the MetroCog's October TTC and Policy Board. But before that, we would like support by each of our local jurisdictions. The city of, at minimum, the city of Fargo and the city of Moorhead, since they do operate the transit system right now. And if West Fargo wishes and Dilworth wishes to also sign on to a letter of support for this plan, we would definitely like to extend that opportunity to them as well. But we will be appearing and making a short presentation to possibly making a short presentation. We're also, like Joe said, putting together a brown bag. So maybe we can keep that presentation really short at each of the commission and council meetings here at the end of September and the beginning of October in preparation for MetroCog's TTC and Policy Board next month.
Okay, so at this point, we would, if the desire of the committee, entertain a motion that it's a resolution supporting the MAT Bus Transit Authority study that would go to the Fargo City Commission and the Moorhead City Council.
This is Brad Olson. I'll make that motion.
But first,
this is John Strand. I'll second the motion.
All right, we have a first and a second. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, motion is carried.
Thank you, everybody. I just really want to thank all of you and all of the members of this committee that participated in our TAC and PAC and have done really great work over the past couple of years. So thank you.
All right, we'll move on to our agenda item 3, which is the operations report, 3A, Matt Peterson.
Okay. Is it easiest if I share my screen, I suppose?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay. Should be able to see it, right?
Not yet. There we go.
Yep, there it is.
Okay. All right, so here's where we're currently at with year-to-date ridership by service type. Broke down the percentages here on Fargo, Moorhead, and paratransit. And then the total trips. So we have 872,000 trips so far this year. And I am only doing this year to date, so you'll see that it actually ends at the end of August here. Compared to 2019 at this time, and I apologize, this graph here was with the 2019 numbers, but the numbers themselves are actually year-to-date numbers. So you can see that Moorhead's down about just over 13%, Fargo's down about 31%, and paratransit is down about 33%. which in reality, we kind of like this just because paratransit is a fairly expensive service for us to operate. But our overall ridership change is just over 26%. And, we see that mostly because of the pandemic that's going on right now. Our ridership has suffered quite a bit over the last couple of months as a result. Going into ridership by route, this was kind of interesting to take a look at. We are doing some farebox upgrades, as we talked about earlier with our GFI software, which is why you'll see like the 13U is not here. These numbers are actually combined with 13, and then the 32s are now combined as well. It won't always be like that, but I wanted to compare apples to apples for this meeting, so I just zeroed those out so that we can kind of see what the ridership is like in those areas of town. Every route is down quite a bit. Route 15, I was really surprised at this, down about 75%, and same with Route 14. I feel, I don't know for sure, but I feel a lot of that has to do with West Acres and what was going on out there, not having our bus hub open, different things like that. And so, again, the numbers aren't surprising due to COVID, but wanted to make sure that we share that with you guys. We have also been having internal conversations regarding possibly reducing some service. We have looked at 15. Route 15 currently operates 15-minute service, which means we have 4 buses on it. And every bus stop is served every 15 minutes. With that type of reduction in ridership, we could look at suspending a couple of those routes until the ridership comes back. However, again, with COVID, it's a fine line because we kind of want the frequency out there for that social distancing and not having so many people on board the vehicles either. Our contractor, First Transit, we've been working with them and talking with them about how they're doing for drivers. They are quite short on drivers, trying to get people in and tested and trained. And they are having some difficulty filling shifts, but at this point, they have not asked us to reduce service because they can't fill it. So we are going to keep having those conversations with them. If we do end up reducing service, Julie, Lori, Jordan, and I spoke about that, and we would set it for a specific time frame, likely through the end of 2020, so through December, if we were to reduce any revenue hours. Here's the Moorhead ridership, routes 1 through 9. Again, you can see some pretty significant dips in there. Route 5 wasn't affected too much, and Route 3 wasn't affected too much. Revenue hours, these revenue hours, we haven't canceled any revenue hours because of COVID. And so this is just because of the calendar year. So we always kind of like to throw that up there because if there's a significant reduction in revenue hours, that will usually correspond to a reduction in ridership as well. The only reduction in revenue hours that we've seen because of COVID is our paratransit number here. Since we have a lot fewer people who are riding our paratransit service, which most of you know is for people with a disability or elderly, they do have to qualify for that service. We've had quite a few less trips booked for that. And so that's why we see such a large change in that one. In Fargo, the biggest change is just going to be based on how the calendar year lines up with Mondays, holidays, things like that, and same within Moorhead. Same kind of goes for the revenue miles. Looking at revenue hours versus revenue miles, it makes sense that the less revenue hours, the less miles. We're on the road less. And then our rides per hour. So Fargo, we're looking at, Moorhead. I apologize, I have a couple of screens and one I control it and the other one you can see. So I'll try and use my mouse on the right one here. So in Moorhead, ridership or rides per hour was around 13 for the 2019 year through in the end of August. Now it's down to about 11.3. So 2 rides per hour, and then in Fargo we had a pretty significant hit of about 5 rides per hour, where we went from our 18.56 down to 13.5. Overall, we had a pretty good change here, a 22.5% change in rides per hour, and that's really the statistic that we use to measure how much frequency or how much service we need to put on the street. In paratransit, we're doing really good, actually. Our rides per hour here has gone up from 2019. Our reservationists have done an amazing job with this pandemic of trying to minimize the number of vehicles out there, capitalize on the rides. They're working with fewer rides, which can be very difficult to try and get effective schedules out there. And they've done a really good job. I was quite impressed. In August, we had almost 5 rides per hour for the month. We've never seen numbers like that before. We're happy right around that 2.25 or 2.5 rides per hour. And so it really drove our average up here for 2022 to be at 2.59. Our calls that come in get generated. You can see that we had quite a few more calls in 2020 throughout June, July, and August when, you know, the peak of that pandemic was kind of hitting there. April and May were a little bit shorter. Just kind of like to give you this information so that you can see what our dispatch staff is having to work with. You know, it's not just the people coming up at the window. It's not just the passengers who are boarding the vehicles or buying fare media, which of course we're not selling right now, but it's also those who are calling us and asking questions, how to ride our service, whether or not our service is going to be open, if we have detours going on, what they need to know about the pandemic, different things like that. Feedback year to date, I threw out the top 6 complaints again. As you can see, employee behavior tends to be the #1 issue we have. We had a total of 56 of them, 15 substantiated, 23 unsubstantiated, meaning we were able to confirm that 15 of the employee behavior complaints did in fact happen, 23 of which we were not able to verify 100%. And then the unclassified, that's always a hard number to explain, but that's generally when we see there's not really a great picture as to whether or not the employee did something wrong, if the passenger did something wrong, or what category that falls into, and so we kind of defaulted into an employee behavior. So we kind of just take those and toss them off to the side because they don't really fit, if you will. The unsafe driving, that's another one that we really take a look at. 9 substantiated unsafe driving incidents versus 11 not. We really want to pride ourselves on safety with our contractor and really reinforcing that, and that's why that's part of our RFP again this year, is telling them, safety is really our #1 priority. All in all, of 188 total complaints for the 2020 year, 55 of which are substantiated. I don't want to say that's good because, complaints are not good. However, we do like to see that the substantiated complaints is significantly less than any of the substantiated or unsubstantiated complaints. And then, of course, the overall total. Same with the incident reports. Kind of looking at the top 6 again, fall and injury, policy issue, passenger behavior, emergency services, employee behavior, and then biohazards. We've seen fewer biohazards, knock on wood, this year than we have in past years, which is great. Those are very expensive and time consuming for our staff to take care of. And then the falls and injuries. That number always scares us because people fall, they trip, different things happen. We never really know what the outcome of that is going to be, until several months, even a year or so later. Again, with the incident summary of 118 incidents for the 2020 year thus far, 85 of which are substantiated. Incidents are very different than complaints. Incidents are reported by our employees, and so we expect to see a higher number of substantiated incidents than unsubstantiated because our employees are reporting those incidents saying, hey, this happened, I want to make the contractor or the city management aware of the situation. And so we go in, we take a look, yep, we verified it, it becomes substantiated. So other feedback items that we do track and miss trips, compliments. We've had a total of 38 compliments. In fact, I just had one again the other day after I updated this, so that's up to 39. We had a lady that was very impressed with how well one of our drivers did on Route 3 in Moorhead. I'll give you a quick scenario of that. She actually took the time, wrote me a letter, and mailed it to me. She's a little bit of more of an old school lady, very nice woman, and wanted to praise the driver who had a passenger on board that missed Route 9 at Cashwise. And the driver, as the passenger was calling GTC to complain, the driver radioed Route 9, rearranged another stop further down the route for him to catch so he wouldn't have to wait another hour. And this lady did a really nice job of documenting that, explaining how thoughtful the driver was, and so we made sure to put that in feedback and let that driver know along with First Transit. So moving into missed trips, these ones, we have all different sorts of reasons for missed trips. Generally, our biggest one is weather related from January, February, March, just to kind of depending on how the winter is going. We do have a few driver error ones. Unfortunately, those happen quite a bit in August, since that's the highest number of new recruits that our contractor has. And so that means we have the highest number of under 1 year or new hire employees out there driving routes. And that does sometimes cause some driver error. 24 is not an outrageous number though. And from what I've been able to ascertain, our contract staff has been doing a good job of training and trying to get all of these drivers familiar with the routes and minimizing any issues that they see. And then mechanical, we're really down on mechanical. Our shop's been doing a fantastic job of maintaining our bus fleet, especially with this pandemic and having them on kind of an alternate schedule. We've had very few mechanical issues that have caused a missed trip. And having a newer fleet definitely helps, but making sure that our staff is staying healthy and able to come to work in the shop and being able to keep up on those PMs or the preventative maintenance is a very good indication that is working. So mechanical logs, not a ton. These are kind of typical things generally related to some of the older vehicles we have in the fleet, which I loosely use the term older. Jordan would have to correct me on this, but I think our oldest vehicle is maybe 10 or 11 years, and so it's scheduled for replacement next year. But not a lot of huge issues. The system failure type is what we actually report to NTD, the National Transit Database, which we have to do yearly, and that does correlate to some of our funding. The major ones are, a failure of a mechanical element that's in revenue service that keeps the vehicle from continuing in revenue service. And then we have other and NA. NA is more or less just kind of like those, biohazards, a dash light, something like that might come on. And so the shop will want to go out and take care of it right away, maybe swap the vehicle out, but it could actually stay out in revenue service. The major is something like a flat tire or a transmission goes out or something along those lines. Again, the numbers are looking pretty good for the 2020 year. And then feedback, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what we're looking at for collision logs. I was really impressed with looking at these numbers. You look at 2019, we had 38 preventable collisions up until this point. In 2020, we've only had 11. So that's a pretty significant change. Non-preventable collisions, we had 44 in 2019, and we've had 14 here in 2020. So the non-preventable, that can be a wide range of things. Our vehicles are parked and someone hits us, someone rear ends us, something where the driver had no control and was not at fault. So that number can fluctuate quite a bit. Preventable, however, what we're seeing there is, we consider a collision preventable if there's anything the driver could have done to minimize or avoid that collision altogether. And to see that number go from 38 in 2019 to 11 in 2020, that shows a huge improvement. And then our insignificant, we do mark that. I'm guilty of this. I back out of my driveway, hit my garbage can because I forget it's Friday. That's kind of what our insignificant ones are. So when we have the buses out there and driving, sometimes, you know, they might tap a bus stop sign with a mirror, or they might, you know, rub the bumper on something, and it doesn't really do damage, but puts a little scuff mark on one of the rubber pieces of the vehicle. We're not going to charge the employee with a collision on that. We all make some smaller mistakes like that, and that's what our insignificant one is. And then unreported is just that. It's, you know, anything that is unreported, that we find that there is damage or something along those lines, and no one bothered to report it, whether it be the contractor employee, our employee, just kind of shows up one day and we don't know where it came from and we can't verify it. So I know I went over that really super quick, and it's a lot of information. We did supply a PowerPoint in your guys' packet, so you have that. Any questions?
Questions for Matt? Okay, thanks for the update, Matt. Let's move on. Our item 3B is the transit COVID-19 response. Taryn.
Hello. So as I'm sure you can all imagine, we've had a lot going on since we last spoke with responding to the situations in our community. We've had to be very agile and flexible to respond to all these changing conditions. Our main wish with this is to make sure that we're communicating everything clearly and consistently with our riders and the community, so that they know that they can rely on our service. What that's been including has been everything from news posts on our website, rider alerts, which people can sign up for, that get direct emailed to each rider, social media on Facebook and Twitter, even physical posters hanging in our downtown hub or on the buses. At the beginning of everything, we also utilized our website alert header, and that would be something that you may have seen on our website. On the main page, it makes that red bar right at the top. So that's something that we use anytime there's something urgent happening. Usually it's when we're going to be canceling service due to a winter storm, something like that. But for the first while, we did use that for all of our COVID updates, so that all of the most relevant and up-to-date information was right at the top. Over time, we were kind of using that as a timeline, and every time something new would happen, we would update that post so you could see kind of the progression of our actions. That post kind of came to be unsustainable because that sort of alert post can only be edited by our leadership staff. So that meant that others of us in the office, like myself, couldn't actually edit or update that. So we did switch to our COVID response website, which is included in your packet, a copy of how it looks currently. I'll give you guys a quick rundown of our timeline and different changes and updates that we made throughout this whole situation. March 12th was the first time that we created that COVID update alert post. It also included lots of resources and links to government agencies and tips for our riders, things like that. We started off when NDSU elected to suspend on-campus circulator service and tap ride in the middle of March 16th. We also had West Acres adjusting their operating hours and then eventually closing the mall, which meant that while we could still access our hub, the passengers had no access to the rest of the mall, which is where the restrooms were. So that did affect our passengers a bit. We did put out a message there to reassure our passengers just of our commitment to keeping service going. We've been pretty lucky to not have much for service reduction, but also letting them know about our increased cleaning and disinfecting processes, those public health tips, about covering your cough and keeping distance and covering your face with a mask or other face covering. March 23rd, we started operating fare free, and that will be continuing to the end of 2020. And the nice thing about this is that when it first started, it allowed us to close the GTC. If we weren't selling any fair media, there was no reason for people to be needing to access the GTC to buy that media. We could distance our dispatchers as well as not having that GTC lobby as a congregating area. We did put out portable toilets at the location once we closed the doors to the lobby. This also allowed us to start using the back door for boarding on the buses. And that helped us to distance passengers from our drivers and really minimize their contact. Our shop also created some really nice plexiglass barriers that were between the front door and driver area and the rest of the bus to have that additional separation. We also suspended Route 2C at the end of March once MSUM canceled on-campus classes. That's our extra bus on Route 2 that runs just during the school year. And also at the end of March, drivers in Moorhead started supporting Meals on Wheels, which we did throughout the summer, I believe to the end of August. Basically, with the cancellation of all these routes, we had lots of drivers who still needed to have something to do and get their paycheck. So we shifted some of them toward doing Meals on Wheels deliveries. Many of them were also staying downtown at our hub and doing additional sanitization between bus trips. So as the bus came in, some of those employees would be on hand to go on and give everything a spray and wipe and just give that extra level of security. In the beginning of May, we did add some extra buses in for Route 4 and Route 15 because we were noticing the road supervisors were telling us that those buses were getting crowded, especially during those peak operating hours. So we added an extra bus to both of those during 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. just to really help riders distance themselves. They could spread themselves out amongst different trips instead of all being concentrated onto a few. At the beginning of April, we actually relocated our downtown hub to the former Fargo Cass Public Health Building once we started GTC construction, and kept up the same rules there with no access to the lobby and spreading the passengers out among 3 different locations on the sidewalks actually helped with distancing as well. Also in April, we started offering grocery delivery service for MAP paratransit customers. Because we had the decreased ridership on MAP paratransit, we had the availability to start offering that to those passengers who were approved. And basically, they can go on to some of the partner stores, grocery stores, Target, Walmart, that we had set up a process with. They could place their order just how they normally would online or by phone, and then just set paratransit as the pickup person. And that was, we were really happy that we could offer that. The paratransit bus would go pick up their groceries for them and deliver it once the passenger called and set up that delivery time. And that service, we are expecting to keep that going as long as we can, as long as we have the space within the paratransit schedule. So it's still going on now. We did also expand it to include seniors age 60 and over. So that's not, it's not required to have that paratransit application eligibility. As long as you're over the age of 60, you are eligible. So it's not being utilized a ton right now, but if you guys know of anybody who could benefit, send them our way. Some of the more recent things, July 25th, we started requiring masks on Moorhead buses. And this was a response to the Minnesota governor's executive order. We had been talking about it internally system-wide, but Minnesota just beat us to the punch. So we had about a week of having the requirements solely for the Minnesota side before we were able to set up that system-wide requirement. And that started August 3rd. Once we had the requirement, we did set up a system for providing complementary disposable masks on board that the driver could distribute throughout the route. We also started offering reusable cloth masks. They are available on request at our downtown hub, so that hopefully that would help minimize the amount of disposable masks that we're having to acquire and give out to people. As of September 1st, because we were going through so many disposable masks, and many people were taking them every single time they rode the bus, not perhaps making the effort or having access to a reusable face covering. That is why we started offering our own reusable ones, and then have stopped offering the complementary disposable ones on board our buses. I believe we still have some in stock, so they are available while supplies last, but we're really encouraging our riders to bring their own face coverings. And that's kind of the timeline of most of what we've done throughout the pandemic. And now we just have that main COVID response page on our website that goes through the overview of the things that we're doing, the things that we expect our passengers to do to assist. There's always going to be that last updated line at the top of the page, so you can see how recent and up-to-date the information is, and then you get that confirmation that you're seeing something that is still accurate. So the big things on there are just that masks are required, but also listing the exceptions for people with medical conditions or disabilities that prevent them from wearing a mask, and for children under 5. Showing people that you do have a lot of options for face coverings, even if you don't have this particular mask. Letting people know there's a section for current map bus service where we can tell them if things are being reduced or added or changed. There's a how you can help section, just listing all of those basic public health bullet points, limiting your trips when possible, leave extra room for that social distancing, covering your mouth, stay home when you're sick. We also try to discourage riders from congregating downtown or from joyriding, which is actually one of our policies, that if you're riding the bus just for fun and not for a particular destination, we're really trying to discourage that to keep the number of people on the bus down. And then we also list the steps that we are taking, such as offering those cloth masks, the types of protective equipment we're giving to our drivers, the fare collection suspension, and using the rear door, the plexiglass barriers, bus sanitization, and then how we're scheduling those buses and paratransit riders. And then, of course, keeping all of the information at the bottom of the page for other local resources. So that's a pretty good overview from my part. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions for Tarm? Okay, thank you, Tarm, for the update. Last couple items. Are any other business that we need to discuss at this time? Okay, hearing none, we are officially adjourned. Thanks, everyone.